Hi, so an update from the Malta Blockchain Summit. Some really interesting talks this morning, particularly the panel talks. The ones I particularly focused on were around healthcare and digital ID projects. So in terms of healthcare, we had Devon Krantz, who's with a company called Molecule. They're looking at early stage funding or alternative funding for what would traditionally have been sort of pharmaceutical type clinical research. So what they're looking at is providing opportunities to encourage people to invest through tokenization in the sort of research that wouldn't ordinarily be funded by the drugs companies. So that's a hugely positive move, I think, in terms of bridging the gap. Because there's an awful lot of areas which fall between two stools in terms of getting the funding to validate the sort of treatment that could be valuable. So that was fascinating. I've got to follow up on that later. In terms of, we then had Dr. Jane Thomason, who's an Australian I've long admired. She's pushing a global agenda around women's health and focusing on parts of the world where healthcare is particularly difficult or non-existent. The conversation was sort of underpinned by a statement which I found fascinating from the World Health Organization, which is that 50% of the areas that we really need to focus on in terms of improving health aren't actually from within the healthcare, traditional sort of healthcare mindset. It's actually around areas like identification, preventing trafficking, so looking at people's freedom, those kind of areas which really have the huge impact on people in more deprived parts of the world. So that was a very interesting conversation. We then had Maria Marenko, who's talking about holistic healthcare, and in particular talking around the link between sports people and their training, and how you can look at healthcare from the point of view of both physical and mental health, and actually tie those two areas together in the context of a sort of single record, and obviously blockchain being at the heart of that conversation. And then finally we had Steve Tendon, who's very familiar to the OXBC Oxford Blockchain group who might be looking at this. So Steve was talking primarily around digital identification and the decentralization of digital ID in the context of using blockchain, and some of the problems that solves in terms of giving us back control over our own identity, but also some of the challenges in terms of being an immutable store for that kind of information, how you manage that, how you verify that. Some of the challenges are just the same as in the physical world, and there's this interesting question around how we focus attention on the boundary between the physical and the digital worlds, in terms of where you might get issues with corruption or inaccurate data, that sort of thing. So that's my story for the morning. Been really interesting. As you can hear from the noise in the background, the attendance has picked up markedly from the 9 o'clock start. But really interesting morning, and and I'll update further later on when I've gone to some more sessions. Cheers.